Well, everywhere you look, it seems like prices are just keep going up and up and up for the things that we buy, the services that we're paying for. And it's a big issue during the current federal election. So I thought I'd chat with David Clement today. He's the North American Affairs Manager for the Consumer Choice Center. And we're going to chat about 5 different things that governments could do to help consumers out that don't require them cutting a big check. So often their answer to life's daily problems is to create new government programs and that. But David's organization's done a lot of research on different ways that governments can help people simply by standing up more for consumers and changing policies rather than through funding. So David, thanks for taking a few minutes to chat today.
No problem at all. Looking forward to it.
So we talked beforehand about 5 different options. One of the first ones that we talked about had to do with price fixing that you sometimes see. Could you tell us a little bit about that and maybe some things that governments could do about that?
Yeah. So the biggest example, or the most prominent example in terms of price fixing in Canadian history, at least, is the example of bread. For almost 14 years, essentially major grocers colluded to fix the price of bread and artificially inflate the price of bread. And obviously that's important. Bread is a staple good. It's something that's consumed by so many Canadians, even those of us who are gluten intolerant still consume gluten-free bread. And it made national headlines, and there was a lot of outrage about what had happened. But that was about it. And there really wasn't much enforcement in regards to the laws that had been broken. And my understanding is that process is still kind of being kicked down the road, as if no one really wants to follow through with levying fines or further investigating to see if it is actually deserving to be a criminal matter. And so it is one of those instances where simply just enforcing what is on the books in terms of price fixing could establish a good baseline to ensure that that illegal instances of price fluctuations aren't going to persist. And then the rest of the policies that we'll talk about are very simple ways that the government can get out of the way to help make things a little more manageable for ordinary Canadians.
You know, I remember that example from a few years back with the bread fixing where you could sign up and get a gift card if you were someone who legitimately had been buying bread.
Yeah.
And you're, as you say, many consumers across the country had to pay more because the companies were colluding. So I guess overall you're saying at the federal level, they could just do a better job of enforcement and keeping an eye on maybe examples where companies are unfairly colluding to charge consumers more.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. It's been hinted at federally in this election. It hasn't gotten much attention, but I do know that Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole has hinted at that being an issue, but it hasn't really gotten the attention I think it deserves, both in that particular case, but on the larger scale in terms of cost of living. So lots more to be said on that.
Okay. Well, that's a good one to kick things off. So why don't we switch from bread over to milk and eggs? Some viewers will know about the issue of supply management and how that works, but could you just give us an overview of how the federal government's supply management policy works in Canada?
Yeah, so supply management is a quota system. It's the only quota system in the world now. There are no other quota systems in the world. And it also includes a series of very, very high tariffs on international imports. And that's part of the reason why we very rarely see foreign products for milk, cheese, chicken, turkey, eggs. And it's not because there aren't world-class products out there. I mean, for every other grocery item, have fish. But it's just because that if they do end up on our shelves, they have to pay or they are charged with those tariffs. And so they're exponentially more expensive and then really just kept out of the marketplace entirely. And so this system was created in the 70s as a means to try and protect the Canadian industry from international competition and insulate it and try and grow it. And now it's really turned into what I would say is just a terrible policy, completely slanted towards producers at the expense of consumers. And so because we limit supply, I mean, this is really just basic basic economics 101. Because we limit supply artificially, that inflates prices. Those inflated prices, I believe, raise the average grocery bill per family by about $500 or so a year. And when we're talking about people who are living paycheck to paycheck, that's about between 100,000 and 200,000 people who could actually be pushed below the poverty line because of these inflated prices. And it's all done to benefit a handful of very politically powerful farmers. And so from my point of view, that would be a no-brainer, is create a plan to peel back supply management, open those markets to international competition. That puts some downward pressure on prices. It also gives us some product variety. And I think that overall, that's a way in which we can put consumers first in terms of food policy.
And at the beginning of this discussion about supply management, use the term quota system. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that is basically where the federal government, through this supply management system, allows different farmers to have a quota in terms of what they can actually produce. And they can't produce more. So you don't have that competition between different firms or different farms to try to produce more. And obviously that would have a downward pressure on price. And at the same time, the government also regulates what you can charge for milk. So it's very much a planned economy in Canada when it comes to milk and dairy products. And as you noted, you have these huge tariffs on imports. So it makes it very difficult for a true market to emerge for those products. And the end result is the Canadian consumer pays a lot more.
Yeah, that's a good description of the quota system. It just artificially restricts what can be produced. And realistically, what can be produced should be what consumers demand. And that's really not what we see. And we also know that that more open and more competitive markets do a much better job of adapting to consumer fluctuations in demand. And so what we've actually seen is we've seen instances of oversupply. We've seen instances of undersupply. We've seen prices be artificially raised because the compensation formula that the supply management system creates guarantees a profit or guarantees a margin. So they're getting a guaranteed margin essentially mandated by government decree, which is not something that beef farmers get. That's not something that pork farmers get. So it's strange that this one relatively small subset of farmers is afforded such a grand privilege. So yeah, that is one of those things which very few of those in politics have spoken about. I know Martha Hall Findlay, the former Liberal candidate for leader against Justin Trudeau, had come out against supply management, and Maxime Bernier had as well. But other than those two, it's relatively quiet, and it's a real shame because that would be a policy that would have a pretty tremendously positive impact on Canadian consumers.
Yeah, for sure. It affects Canadians right across the country, costs hundreds of extra dollars per family every year. We actually did a report in 2019 on this, and we looked at the cost of milk at a number of Canadian cities and compared those often with American cities just over the border. And the end result was that Canadians were paying about 29% more at that time for every time they go and buy a jug of milk or whatever. And that was after you account for the difference in the currency and so forth.
And here's the kicker in regards to that is that the Dairy Farmers of Canada, the organization, will always say, no, Canadian milk is not more expensive. We're making false comparisons. I see this all the time. And the response to that is, okay, well, if it's not more expensive, why do you care if they're going to compete on the shelf with you?
Yeah.
Why does it matter? And it matters because they know that prices are just more competitive in the United States and more competitive elsewhere. I mean, there are countries like New Zealand who have no farm subsidies whatsoever, and yet they manage to make a pretty solid go at it. So it is an interesting subject, very niche. But yeah, there's probably time to get on to some of the other more popular policies that could be changed to help Canadian consumers.
All right. Well, with that in mind, like I said, we do have a report on our website, and any viewers can go there and take a look. I'm sure you guys have some content too. Let's go on to housing. A big issue. Lots of people are talking about it. I think a lot of people can relate to it if you've been in the market for a house in the past several years. Even it's just gotten to be more and more expensive. It's especially hard for young people to get into the market. So what at the federal level do you think could possibly be done to help consumers out?
So, I mean, at the federal level, there's some monetary policy changes that could be made. Those are rather obscure. I think really the only person talking about that is Pierre Poilievre, and that's it's a little bit in the abstract. In terms of something that is a little more concrete that the federal government can do, which is something that has been proposed by Aaron O'Toole, is to tie federal funding to some sort of density target. And so what we have across Canada, especially in major cities, is old single family zoning requirements. And that prohibits mixed use, medium density, high density development in the places where Canadians want to live the most, because that's where the jobs are. And what happens is those in the community vehemently oppose anything that's even remotely close to mixed density. We call those people the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard folks. And they have a pretty good grapple on local politics. And so that is one way that the federal government can kind of try and tilt the scales a little bit in favor of some higher density, especially in areas where we need it. I mean, if you look at the Toronto area, where I live in Oakville, a house just around the corner from me sold for just over $1 million in 2018. And it was listed last month at $1.35 million and sold for $1.49 million. If you had given that money, the cash, the down payment, to the number one hedge fund in the world, you would be poorer today than if you bought that house. And so when you put that into perspective, that right there for me highlights just how crazy the affordability issue is getting. And so there has to be a lot more done at the municipal level, at the provincial level, and then whatever can be done at the federal level.
Yeah. And that's always been my understanding, is that it's more of a local issue rather than something that the federal government can do. But like you said, I think there are things that the federal government could look at. So often the federal government, extends its long tentacles into funding things at the municipal level, and maybe they could use as you talk about sort of this idea of saying, okay, well, if you want these dollars for infrastructure, then you have to do this, you have to do that. I personally don't like that idea of Ottawa interfering in local government activities, but it's happening. So like you say, it's one thing that could maybe be done to start to see more supply. Because if we have more supply, then there's going to be an easement in terms of what consumers are paying on the cost side of the equation. So,
and then it puts an important question to local municipal voters. So are you so opposed to development that you will agree to fairly substantial increases in your municipal and property taxes to cover whatever the federal funding gap will be? So you have to put your money where your mouth is. How much do you really hate development? Do you really hate development enough to have your property taxes go %? Maybe you do, but I would bet you a lot of people don't. And so you would see an increase in density. And we're not talking like skyscrapers in the middle of suburbia. We're talking stacked townhomes even modest proposals for density are often opposed for what I think are really bogus reasons.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It really helps, I think, draw more attention to the issue and get everyday people looking at it a bit differently when you see Ottawa saying, hey, municipalities, you got to start looking at this. Number 4 on the list, airline costs.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple quick thoughts about what could be done there to help consumers out when they have to go and buy a plane ticket the next time around.
Yeah, so the big one is in Canada, we do not allow foreign carriers to fly domestic routes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem because we're a particularly big country. So some of these laws exist in Europe, but most of the countries in Europe are not necessarily large enough where you're going to fly between two places. And there are other transport options like high-speed rail and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But other countries like Australia have gotten rid of this rule that says only domestically owned carriers can fly domestically.
Mm-hmm.
And what that will do is, I mean, anyone who's flown in Canada or from Canada knows that our options are very limited.
Mm-hmm.
You're really picking between Air Canada, WestJet, Air Transat, and then maybe with some of the new emerging discount airlines, depending on where you want to go. There isn't really much choice. And the way I frame this to people who don't really understand this, the concept, right? It's technically called cabotage rules or law. Is I put it very simply: should British Airways be allowed to fly from London, England, to Toronto, to Vancouver?
Mm-hmm.
And almost always the answer is yes. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say no. And most people say, well, isn't that already legal? And the answer is no, it's not already legal. But imagine if rather than just being stuck with Air Canada or WestJet for that flight, you would have the option of British Airways or Alitalia or Lufthansa or any other international carrier who regularly fly to Canada, but would maybe want to economize their route by stopping in additional Canadian cities. And the same would go for American Airlines and their carriers. And so, yeah, that would be a huge plus for Canadian consumers. It would put some much needed competition into the market. And right now, at least pre-COVID, I think we were 65th globally in terms of flight affordability. So our cost per 100 kilometers traveled is about 2.1 times higher than the US, 2.8 times higher than New Zealand, and 3.6 times higher than a country like Portugal. And so something has to be done to fix that. It doesn't cost us any money to just allow these carriers to fly domestic routes. And really, we're talking about world-class carriers who meet the same safety requirements and all of those things that we have domestically. And so for me, that's a real no-brainer in terms of maximizing routes and getting costs down.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but just on that example of British Airways flying from, say, London to Toronto to Vancouver, they can fly it right now, but they can't pick up customers in Toronto and charge them to fly from Toronto to Vancouver. So they lose some people. They're only flying from London to Toronto. Some passengers get off, so now maybe half the plane is empty, and they can't fill up that half with new customers. Isn't that the sort of the catch point, or am I wrong on that?
I don't know if that is. I know that whatever the way in which the law is written today, it does not allow for them to sell that flight.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Where really, if they could economize that and sell that as a domestic route, that's where you start to see downward pressure. Because if they're already going to Vancouver, they can pick people up in Toronto, and then all of a sudden you have a $350, $400 ticket rather than $700 ticket.
Yeah.
And then catch the flight going back the other way. And this is what's done internationally. I've flown Air India from Toronto to London, England, en route to Amritsar, India. And then I flew that route home. And they just happened to throw London in as the middle part so that they could economize the flight and have it full to get to India. There's no reason why that shouldn't happen domestically. I mean, that's a great thing. The airlines are able to make more money. There are more jobs associated with that. Prices go down, and you have more flight availability, which is a real question for us in terms of post-COVID. Is what does that look like?
Yeah.
It'll probably be quite a while before we get to where we were in terms of flight availability before the pandemic.
And I'll just add to that. I think there'd be an environmental benefit too, right? If you're able to use these flights more efficiently rather than having planes flying with half the capacity. Let's go on to last but not least, cell phones. It's pretty well known Canadians pay a fortune for our cell phone bills each month. What do you think could be done there?
Yeah, this is just allowing international carriers to compete in Canada. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago that this was proposed. It was almost possible. It almost happened. Verizon contemplated coming to Canada, and our oligopoly of telecommunications providers essentially lit their hair on fire and launched a very large PR campaign, creating this mythical scenario where this boogeyman American company wasn't going to serve the interests of Canadians, which I mean, it was certainly a farce at the time. But as we've progressed from that point, it's not like they've cleaned up their act and all of a sudden we have better prices and better connectivity and things like that. And so that is something that absolutely needs to be done, is the allowance for foreign carriers to enter the Canadian market. O'Toole has referenced this, but he did it with one uncomfortable caveat. And that uncomfortable caveat is we will let foreign carriers operate in Canada if we get reciprocal treatment abroad. And I understand why he would say that. It's very popular to say that and say that you're defending Canadian jobs and Canadian businesses. But realistically, we shouldn't harm our own consumers because other governments are harming their own consumers.
Right.
Because if the Americans were to say, no, we don't want Bell or Rogers, or pick any country for that matter, they're harming their consumers by not allowing for more competition and more commerce. We shouldn't shoot ourselves in the foot because they're shooting themselves in the foot. And so while it's popular to phrase it in that way and to look at it as if we need to get a good deal, it really is a disservice to ordinary Canadians, because I think that ordinary Canadians should be priority one. And for them, it's got to be about lowering prices, increasing internet connectivity. I mean, we talk about things like rural internet, Indigenous communities. Yeah. Obviously, the current system is failing there. So let's see what else we can get into the mix and try and inject some life into what's been a pretty stale sector for a while.
No, for sure. And one question for you about that idea of allowing foreign carriers into Canada to compete. I don't know if Erin O'Toole's platform talks about this, but in your opinion, should there be any safeguards in place when it comes to companies like Huawei trying to get in, where there's sort of national security questions? Has that been contemplated, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that that's appropriate, especially for a company like Huawei. I don't think that they should be involved in any of the 5G infrastructure, just because we're dealing with what is now a hostile state in China, whom has for a while now very much blurred the lines between private business and public policy. And what I mean by that is not, oh, they're heavy-handed and they're regulating businesses. It's in I'm not going to quote the law correctly, but it's in a charter in their country that things have to be handed over to the government if they're requested. Yeah. And given what the Chinese government is doing right now, actively committing genocide, it certainly has to be a consideration in terms of national security. And then also to let's say American companies like Apple. You look at the very terrible terrorist incidents that have happened in I believe it was in California, and the U.S. government lobbied Apple to create a backdoor so that they could access Apple phones. And Apple said, no, we know that you would like it in this instance, and this is a really terrible instance, but we're not going to give you the keys to the castle because we don't trust you. Businesses in China don't have the opportunity to do that. And that's a very important distinction. So for foreign carriers, there would be some foreign policy considerations in there. I know that O'Toole has been relatively tough on questions about China and national security. So I'm certain that his answer would be similar to mine in terms of saying no.
Okay. Well, that's great. I think you've given us lots of good ideas and information on ways that governments could help consumers out without simply creating new programs and spending our money, which is often before it's the default option.
Yeah.
That politicians so often go to. As I referenced at the beginning, your organization's done a ton of research on this. I know you've written a lot about it. Where can people go if they want to find out more information about your organization?
Yeah, consumerchoicecenter.org. You can see all of our research, all of our media hits, everything that we've written, both in Canada and abroad. So we're an international organization. We publish in probably 30 different countries in a given month, with lots of policy talks for you to chew on. So if you're interested in that type of stuff, consumerchoicecenter.org is where to find all of it.
Well, that's perfect. Thanks a lot for your time today, David.
Appreciate it.